Okay, so why don't we get started? Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm really glad to be here with all of you today, and I just wanted to thank C4 Events and especially Jesse O'Donoghue for coordinating this event. It's really an honor to be here and to be speaking about two issues that are really close to my heart and are really meaningful to me, both personally and professionally. So I'm just so glad to have all of you here today. And I'm broadcasting here from Los Angeles, here in my office in West LA, for any of you who are familiar with the different parts of Los Angeles. And I don't know exactly where all of you are coming from in terms of clinical background, but I'm going to assume that some of you know a little bit about brain spotting, or a little bit or a lot about sexual addiction. Some of you may be somatically trained, some of you may not, but what I want to recognize is that all of you bring talents and wisdom to what you do already, and hopefully today I'm going to be sharing some ideas that will complement what you're already doing with your clients, and some tools and strategies that will be relevant to what you may complement what you're already doing. So I just want to recognize all of the talent that you bring to this discussion today. So I am going to be taking questions, but I'm not going to be addressing them until the end of our time together. So I'm going to be leaving about 5 or 10 minutes, depending on how things are progressing, to talk about any questions that you may have for me. And if you can share your question, if you want to share your name or where you are, it's up to you. It's all optional, but I welcome any and all questions that you may have about today's presentation. So all of you know that sex addiction is rampant in our country and in the world at large. And what we have learned is that it's actually 3 to 5% of the US population that is sexually compulsive in one form or another, which means that more than 10 million people are dealing with sexual compulsivity. That's a lot, 10 million people. And by the way, I use the terms sex addiction, sexual compulsivity, problematic sexual behavior, out of control sexual behavior. I use them interchangeably because to me, it doesn't matter what we call it. It's really more about the suffering that still goes on out there and how we can provide some kind of healing for folks who are still suffering and having difficulties with sex addiction. My particular focus and my passion is working with clients who have gotten past the compulsive behaviors, gotten past the destructive or self-destructive behaviors, and are still having difficulties finding ways to establish some kind of traction in their lives, some kind of meaning or purpose or direction. And so that's really been my focus for many years, and something that I again hold close to my heart, which I'll talk about in a moment. So today, as we know, we're going to be talking about brain spotting and sex addiction. And what I believe is that these particular issues may seem very different, but they can really work well together. And as we progress in our talk today, you'll see what I mean. So I don't know how many of you actually read my bio or not, but briefly, I've been in practice as a psychotherapist since 1992. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I'm also a somatic experiencing practitioner, a certified brain spotting practitioner, a certified group psychotherapist. I'm kind of a training junkie, actually. And one of the things that I bring today is that brain spotting has really enhanced my practice this past 5 or 6 years in a way I never imagined, and really added another layer in addition to the somatic experiencing training that I had underneath of that. And so I'm going to be sharing a little bit about what brain spotting is about and how it can be used with those in recovery from sex addiction. So what many people don't know about me is that I've been in recovery from sex addiction for 25 years. Actually, in November, it'll be 25 years. And it's something that is part of my life and part of my own healing. And not only do I call myself a recovering sex and love addict, but I also consider myself to have some love avoidance, some codependence, some recovering perfectionism. I really kind of have, I believe that when we're talking about sex addiction, we're not just talking about sex addiction. We're really talking about the pain and trauma underneath of it. We're also talking about what I call the brokenheartedness that goes along with sex addiction, whether it's the brokenheartedness that is before the sexually compulsive behavior begins, or whether it's the brokenheartedness that is a result. Either way, brokenheartedness is part of what I really focus on in terms of healing and helping individuals find their way beyond their addiction. So one of the things that I just want to say as a little editorial is that I believe that there still is a lot of misunderstanding and myths around sexual addiction, even with all the knowledge and all the different education that we go through as professionals and as clinicians. Both professionals and lay people still have difficulty understanding sex addiction sometimes. And so part of my work is really about destigmatizing sex addiction and educating others. So let's get started with our talk today. Today's presentation is going to start with a little bit about what I really mean by brokenheartedness, because it is a big term that doesn't always have specific definition. I'm going to talk about what sexual sobriety is, emotional sobriety, a little bit of the background of Brainspotting and what it really is in the office. And then we're going to talk about how sex addiction and Brainspotting can go together and how Brainspotting can be a modality used towards the healing of sex addiction and further one's belief in purpose and direction in one's life. The reason I came up with the term brokenheartedness in general is because I don't believe that it's helpful to pathologize sex addiction. I believe that because we're talking about things like trauma, abuse, neglect, abandonment, grief and loss, these are parts of one's misery. Oops, sorry about that. These are parts of what people go through in life that oftentimes results in various types of addiction and sex addiction. And some people say, well, let's just look at it as the disease model or the medical model. And I don't go in that direction because I don't think it's helpful to pathologize sex. I really feel that sex and intimacy, as integrating sex and intimacy as a healthy element, is really the direction therapeutically that we're looking at. And in order to get there, in order to integrate sex and intimacy in healthier ways, addressing, exploring, and resolving trauma, abuse, neglect, abandonment, and grief are really essential. And so I came up with the term brokenheartedness because I feel that that really captures really what all of us have, whether we're sex addicts or not. We all have levels of brokenheartedness. So as clinicians, we're not only mending broken hearts of our clients, we're also mending the broken hearts of ourselves. So how do we do that? These are what I call the lovebirds. And what I'd like you to do just for a moment is just check in with your heart. Check in as you look at these two birds and notice what's happening in your body. Just notice what's happening in your heart. And I believe that one of the antidotes, is not the only antidote, but one of the antidotes to brokenheartedness is love, intimacy, and connection. Deeper connection, right? Authentic connection. Having emotionally reliable, emotionally dependable relationships in our life, what we sometimes call secure attachments, really is the healer. So I really do look at sex addiction as an attachment issue or as an intimacy issue. And if we can help our clients open the channel of giving and receiving love, we've done our job. I mean, I actually think about this when any client walks into my office, but especially those dealing with addictions or sex addiction, is their love patterns, their attachment patterns are generally really complicated. And so what we can do over time to help those attachment patterns and love patterns open up and be more available to them really is the healer that mends the broken heart. And we'll be talking more about that. So some of you may already know what sexual sobriety means, but I just wanted to go over this briefly. So the idea of sexual sobriety is really when someone stops the destructive or self-destructive behaviors, and when they've established what behaviors they want to give up and what behaviors they want to introduce in their life. So for instance, in Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, their language is bottom line behaviors and top line behaviors. And the bottom line behaviors are those behaviors that you absolutely want to stop. And they actually count time, just like in AA. They'll count time based on the number of days they stay away from their bottom line behaviors. Top line behaviors, on the other hand, sometimes get shortchanged, but they're really, really important because top line behaviors are those things that you want to bring into your life, whether it be relationships or activities or experiences or things that really are enriching. So that's what is sometimes called a sexual recovery plan. It's usually developed with a sponsor, with a therapist, with a coach, and that's really the starting gate. Okay, so sexual sobriety is really the very beginning when somebody is able to give up those behaviors that are so dysregulating and so ungrounding for them. Okay, so again, you probably all know this, but sex, money, food are three things in our life that generally we can't do without in one form or another. They're all necessary, but how do we use them in moderation and minimize risk? So with sex, of course, the question is, how do we focus on top line behaviors? How do we focus on things that are really going to enrich ourselves? And how do we stay away from those things that are depleting, destructive, self-destructive? Okay. So what I said at the bottom here is really important. We have to consider the idea that sexual sobriety is truly the starting gate. And once somebody has some traction in being sexually sober, then their nervous system can regulate in a more consistent way. Because when somebody's acting out sexually, they're dysregulated pretty much all the time, right? Sometimes more, sometimes less, but it's very difficult to have a consistent regulated nervous system. So to be able to regulate, feel resilient, feel resourceful, that only happens once sexual sobriety is achieved. And then we're going to talk in a moment about emotional sobriety and what that looks like. And again, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to be emotionally sober unless sexual sobriety is under your belt. So what is emotional sobriety? This is a term that's been popping up more and more recently. It's actually been around a long time, but it seems like it's been getting more popular in a way. One of my colleagues, Dr. Tian Dayton, you may know her, Tian, T-I-A-N, Dayton, D-A-Y-T-O-N. Dr. Dayton wrote a book about emotional sobriety. And in the first chapter of my book, she gave me permission to share some of her characteristics of emotional sobriety, but this is what I came up with as a quick and easy way of thinking about emotional sobriety. It's really about building capacity to experience the fullness of life, to experience a sense of hope, to experience a sense of expansion. That's the first thing, that internally our clients get to feel more capacity for all of those things. The next one is I like the three R's. That's one way of me remembering it, that it's actually a resilient, resourceful, regulated state of well-being. Okay, so it's about well-being, of course, but it's resilient, it's buoyant, it's resourceful, it's regulated. It's about the nervous system really feeling more like yourself. And that's what I say at the bottom here, is that when you feel most like yourself, and that's kind of an objective way of looking at it, but it's really when you feel comfortable in your own skin. I mean, how many of your clients come in and say, I just want to crawl out of my skin. I just don't feel comfortable with myself. So when we start hearing things about, I had a few minutes today when I felt really comfortable. I felt really calm and peaceful and grounded and a little bit comfortable in my skin. That's when we know we're heading in the right direction and our clients are feeling more emotionally sober. So I put together what I call the 4 R's, and emotional sobriety and regulating the nervous system to me go hand in hand. Okay, so the 4 R's go like this. How do we teach our clients to relax? And it sounds so simple, right? But relaxation is an art. And it's something that many of us don't really do, because I'm talking not about vegging in front of a TV, but more like the physiological changes that happen when we meditate for 10 minutes, or when we're in Shavasana in a yoga class, right? The physiological changes that truly let our system, our nervous system, relax. The next R is regulate. And regulation is a word that has come up, I think, in recent times in ways that surprises me. Because when I was in grad school back around 1990, we didn't use the terms regulation and dysregulation. We didn't even talk about the nervous system. So it's very exciting to know that today we're truly looking at the nervous system as part of the healing. And regulation, which we're going to be looking at in a moment, is really that idea of when we're feeling most like ourselves, when we're feeling most buoyant, okay? And by the way, I didn't say this before, but when I was an earlier therapist, when I was a younger therapist, I was very traditional. I worked psychodynamically, I worked from a family systems perspective. And what happened was I just kept hitting walls, because I was working with a lot of folks who had various levels of trauma and addictions, and we would just get stuck at a certain point. And now that we're integrating the nervous system, now that I'm bringing in the somatic awareness, now that we're considering how SE, somatic experiencing, and brain spotting can help those who have frozen nervous systems or those who have hypervigilant nervous systems, that it brings in not only a whole new language, but a whole new awareness of how the mind, body, and spirit truly works cohesively in the best of times, I should say. The third R is respond. And I'm going to share a quick example. So and here I say respond rather than react, right? So my husband is a sunflower seed eater, and he eats sunflower seeds with the shell on them. And for some reason recently, he's been eating more and more of these sunflower seeds. And this was something that my mom did when I was growing up. And my mom was a smoker, and she was a sunflower seed eater, and she was just, she paid more attention, I'm sorry to say, and she did her best, but she paid more attention to other things, reading the paper, smoking her cigarettes, cracking her sunflower seeds. And when my husband started to use the sunflower seeds more and more and crack them more and more, I would have a visceral reaction. It would be very difficult for me to be in the same room with him. And generally, I could react and say, "What are you doing? This is awful." But instead, what I did was I removed myself from the room. I did a little deep breathing. I distracted myself a little bit on the computer, and then I came back and talked to him about him cracking the sunflower seeds. Now, long story short, we have an agreement now about him not doing it when I'm in the room, because it actually is a small trauma reaction for me. But responding rather than reacting is huge, right? And so finding tools, not finding strategies like taking yourself on a timeout, or finding a positive distraction, or calling a friend, or calling a sponsor, or meditating for a few minutes, anything that will keep you from reacting and keeping us more in a responsive and a more present place. Okay. And lastly, relate. And maybe this is it's not the most important one, but when I talk about relate, I'm going back to the lovebirds, okay? And the lovebirds, interpersonally, or interbirdly, I'm not sure what the term would be, they seem to have it down to a science. I mean, they just seem to really enjoy cuddling and being with one another. So that part of relating was easy for them. How we connect to ourselves is a challenge, but when I say connection to self, I'm really talking about, again, feeling more comfortable in one's skin and feeling regulated. And then if you have a spiritual belief, like a higher power, like God, like any universal energy, that's another way of relating. So relating is three-dimensional: connecting to ourselves, connecting to reliable others, and connecting to a higher power, or a power greater than oneself. So let's move on to brain spotting. So I'm going to share my journey to brain spotting briefly. Brain spotting came into my life about 6 years ago, and this always happens to me, where I notice some colleagues who are doing some trainings that seem to be changing their practices and changing their whole approach to healing. And a few of my colleagues, who I respect quite a bit, had done the brain spotting training and said, you know, you really should give it a try. It's fantastic. And I think it'll complement your somatic experiencing training beautifully. So I went to my first training, and the trainer, her name, she has a great name. Her name is Dr. Pi Frey. That's her real name, Pi, P-I-E, Frey, F-R-E-Y. Pi is from Boulder, and she is a very, very loving, bright, talented, intuitive clinician and brain spotter. And so after a weekend with Pi, I was a little love addicted to her, but I was also very honored to have participated in the 4-day, no, I think it's a 3-day training, or it was at the time. So some of you may know that brain spotting was developed by a gentleman named David Grand. And David Grand is a psychologist out of New York City, and he was one of the pioneers, actually, of EMDR. He was one of the EMDR folks who was based in New York back in the early 90s. And before I forget, David was also a psychoanalyst back in the 80s, which I think is fascinating. So his background is psychoanalytic. But he got into EMDR in the early 90s, and then he developed his own version of EMDR, which he called natural flow EMDR. And then in 2003, he discovered brain spotting, and I'll share that in a moment, how that happened. Nowadays, and this is only 16 years since he founded brain spotting, there's more than 13,000 brain spotters and counting all around the world. He trains mostly in other countries, actually. And there's more than 22 countries represented with brain spotters, which is very exciting to me. And I just wanted to shout out to Dr. Grand that this really has added a dimension to my practice, which has been so fun, really, and so meaningful to me. And there's one of our trainers in particular from Sydney. Her name is Roby Abilis, and Roby, focuses a lot on addiction. She has actually a setup and a method for working with addictions that we're not going to get into today, but it's fantastic. And I just wanted to mention her as well because I use her method and feel so grateful to all of them, to Pi, David, and Roby. So when you look at this little girl, again, if you could just check in with yourself and notice what happens inside of you. Of course, this is a beautiful little girl, and she's gazing into the distance, right? And some people might say, well, she's gazing, but isn't she just daydreaming, right? Isn't that just what little girls do or little boys do, or what grown-ups do? We daydream sometimes. Well, what we know, and through the research, what we're finding out more and more is actually she is processing something. There's some kind of subcortical material inside of her brain that is being processed. And this is actually a form of brain spotting called gaze spotting, G-A-Z-E. And what Dr. Grand tells us is that where you look affects how you feel. So if you look upward to the left, you'll feel one way. If you look downward to the right, you'll feel another way. And so where you look affects how you feel. All right, so how does figure skating fit into this discussion? Well, Dr. Grand had been working with a figure skater, a 16-year-old pre-Olympian figure skater for about a year back in 2002, 2003. And during that year, they were only doing EMDR. And most of you know that that's all about eye movement back and forth. And she was making some progress, but she was still having difficulty landing a particular jump. It was actually the triple loop that she could not land. And Dr. Grand has a specific specialty area with top athletes and performers and entertainers. And this particular figure skater was a bit of an enigma to him because for some reason the EMDR just wasn't making a difference with the triple loop, and that was really getting in her way. What happened was, in one session, they were doing the normal passes back and forth with the EMDR, and for some reason, Dr. Grand slowed it down. And when he slowed down and found a particular fixed point, she seemed to have a lot of eye movement and eye wobbling and a different kind of processing than they had ever seen before. And he asked her, he said, would it be okay to just stay at this one point so we can see what happens? And she said, of course, let's give it a try. So in about a 20-minute period, she was processing in a different way and in a more rapid way than either of them had ever seen before. And she left the session, and Dr. Grand said, give me a call from the rink tomorrow, because of course she practiced every day, and tell me what happened. And so sure enough, she went to the rink, and you probably can guess what happened. She did not miss the triple loop. She couldn't miss it. She had a flawless triple loop over and over again. What Dr. Grand believes and what he's learned is that memories of her trauma as a child and unprocessed memories of lots and lots of sports injuries through the years were released, were processed with a lot of emotion and nervous system release. So it was through her eyes, it was through her body temperature increased when she was in session, she got shaky, wobbly. It was really a lot of processing that's happening. Sure enough, as I said, she landed the triple loop, and the story goes that she never had that problem again. So what do you think Dr. Grand did after that? He started to do this method, which he eventually called Brainspotting, with lots of clients, lots of colleagues, and lots of family members and friends, anybody who would give it a try with him. And he was seeing results that were very different than he had ever seen before with EMDR. And it's not that EMDR doesn't have effectiveness, because we know that it does, but they both have effectiveness in different ways. And he was just very enthusiastic about the findings that he found, and he started to develop this training program for brain spotting. Brain spotting is what he calls an open integrative model. So for instance, I worked psychodynamically in family systems for many years, right? And brain spotting is just an added dimension, an added layer on top of my existing theoretical orientation. So he has a background psychoanalytically, and he still draws from that background. If somebody comes from a CBT background or comes from a background of, let's say, attachment, whatever your background is, brain spotting actually complements it and adds a new tool, a new method to complement what you're already doing. And that's really great, because in our trainings, I meet people who are from all kinds of different backgrounds. And brain spotting is really like a piece of the puzzle, as you can see in this picture below. So what is a brain spot? I'm going to share with you. Okay, let me read this first, and then I'll share with you what happens in the session in the office. So brain spot is found through the eyes. We use the visual system, okay? And it corresponds with the activation in the brain and the body. Once we find a brain spot, and there's many, many brain spots in somebody's visual field, so it's not like there's just one at any given time. This is where the processing occurs for the entire session. So I'm not going to demonstrate it, but I'm going to give you a quick sense of what brain spotting really looks like in the office. So we have pointers that are extendable pointers, kind of like what a teacher or a lecturer might use. And what we do is we ask the client what they want to focus on, something that could be recent, something that could be in their background as a child, but anything that was too much to process at the time. And so what happens is let's say somebody says, well, I'm going to use an example that I'm not going to use names, of course, but I had a client come in, and she said when she separated from her husband, her two daughters and her were very bereft. They were very upset about this whole thing. And there was a moment when they separated, when the three of them just embraced, and all of them cried together. And that particular moment was etched in her brain, where she felt so upset that her kids were so upset and she was so upset that she felt like she never really had a chance to process that at the time. It was just too much to process. And by the way, one thing about brain spotting that's important to keep in mind is that it's not just for trauma. It's really for anything that is disturbing or upsetting or difficult to process. So it could be a fight that you had with your spouse, or it could be childhood abuse of some kind. It's any of the above. So back to the example. So in session, she said, yeah, I just, this one memory, this one image is just very painful. And so when she was telling me the story, I said to her, okay, so in your body right now, what are you noticing? And she said her chest was feeling constricted, that her throat was closing up a little bit, and that she was kind of heating up a little bit. She noticed heat in the back of her neck. And I said, just notice those, and from 0 to 10, how activating are you right now as we're talking about this? And she said, I'd say about a 6 or a 7. Okay, so let's use the pointer across your visual fields. We're going to start all the way to your left, and we're going to go to your right, and we're going to find where your body feels the most activation. And most of the time, my clients can identify and isolate where that spot is. Not everybody can do that, but I would say most of the time people can do that. And once we find that spot, we stay there. And she looks at the pointer, And she might report in from time to time what's happening internally, but we don't want to talk too much because the brain is a supercomputer and we don't want to interrupt or slow it down. But from time to time, she would say to me, "Yeah, I'm thinking about that moment, and I'm finding myself being tearful right now, and I'm just so sad that I put my kids through that." So just notice in your body where that activation is. And she says, "Okay, it's still in my chest, it's still in my throat, etc." So fast forwarding a little bit, what she said by the end of the session is, my chest is less constricted, my throat has opened up, and my temperature has evened out. And that, I said to her, that's exactly what we're looking for. Let's just notice that. And from 0 to 10, how activating is that right now? And she said, it's more like a 3, maybe even a 2. Excellent. So let's just notice that, and we'll talk about how that experience was for you. So I always leave some time at the end of the session to debrief. So the brain spot is where the activation shows up the most, where the activation is accentuated. It's not easy to explain that without a demonstration, so I apologize if that felt a little esoteric, but hopefully that will give you a little sense of what we're talking about. Dual attunement is really what brain spotting is all about, the relationship between the client and the therapist, but also the neurobiological attunement between the two nervous systems. What we say is that the client and the nervous system of the client is like the head of a comet, and the brain spotting therapist is like the tail. So I'm just following. Nothing is being done to a client. What we're doing is we're following the nervous system, and we're trusting that the wisdom of the nervous system will lead us wherever it needs to go. I love this expression. Some of you may have heard it already. Neurons that fire together wire together. I love the expression, but I also love that it was coined in 1949, which is unbelievable, very advanced and ahead of its time. But if we think about the well-worn path of sex addicts being the sexually compulsive, obsessive behavior, and our work is to help them find new neural pathways, right? To practice new ways of connecting, new ways of having intimacy, new ways of regulating. I'm not going to go over this at length because I want to get to the brain spotting and sex addiction piece. But what I can say about this, and some of you may know this already, is that this is called the window of tolerance. I actually call it the resilience zone. And by the way, the bracket on the right-hand side of the visual here is supposed to say resilience zone. For some reason, it lost itself there, but that should say resilience zone. But basically what this says is that in between the two dotted lines is where we feel most regulated, buoyant, resourceful, and hopefully relaxed. It's actually the fullness of everything that we are: thoughts, feelings, images, sensations, etc. But life comes along and we dysregulate from time to time, whether it's in road traffic, whether it's with relationships. And sometimes we upregulate and get stuck on high, like as if the accelerator is stuck on. And sometimes we downregulate and go into the brake being on. And so when a client, or when within ourselves, we're feeling high anxiety or hypervigilant or irritable, etc., that's an upregulation. And when we go down into depression, disconnection, dissociation, etc., that's when we're in a lower place within our nervous system. So the idea here is, how can we, number one, have awareness when we're dysregulated, because sometimes we don't even know, oh, I'm dysregulated, I'm feeling highly anxious, or I'm feeling numb. But how do we more efficiently come back to a regulated state? And that's That's a lifelong practice, okay? So finding ways of staying within those two dotted lines more of the time is really the clinical direction. So I want to share a quick case study, and this is a composite case study. So even though I call it Debbie's story, it's really about a few people that I wrapped into one. When I first spoke with Debbie on the phone, she let me know she was losing sleep, but wasn't ready to share more details. When I met her for the first time, eye contact was minimal and her posture was poor. I've seen this many times before, and it's almost always related to trauma, shame, and helplessness. Once she settled into the office, Debbie barely looked up at me. She was in her mid-20s and her capacity for real connection was severely limited. I reassured her that she could use as many or as little words as she chose. We were going to get to know her nervous system through a combination of feelings, thoughts, sensations, images, and memories. Sometimes words would be helpful, but oftentimes slowing down and building awareness in the here and now would be the primary focus. Over time, Debbie started to tell me about challenges she was facing. Debbie disclosed that she used to have sex almost every day, and when she wasn't with a sex partner, she was masturbating compulsively. Currently, she was having trouble sleeping because of flashbacks and nightmares. Little by little, Debbie shared the depth of her brokenheartedness. She was anally penetrated by a male teenage babysitter when she was 7 years old, and a male gym teacher exposed himself multiple times when she was 14. Instead of feeling protected by her parents, she felt alienated, abandoned, and deeply misunderstood. By the time she left for college at 19, Debbie was having sex with men and women multiple times a week, sometimes multiple times a day, and it was becoming riskier, including anonymous and public sex. She knew that the daily sex medicated her residual pain from early childhood trauma, but her nervous system was getting worn down, resulting in panic attacks, insomnia, and dissociation. Over the course of her therapy, she began to understand when she was feeling regulated or dysregulated in her body. This awareness empowered her and left her feeling hopeful that she wasn't at the mercy of her traumatic past. When she found a pleasant memory or relationship that felt calm and grounding, we would pause to help her nervous system experience a deeper sense of safety. Our therapeutic relationship became one of her resources, both in the office and during the week, as she started to trust that we could collaboratively heal her nervous system. It's been 3 years since I first met Debbie. Now her nightmares and flashbacks are less intrusive, but still show up at times of extreme stress. Her sleeping patterns have normalized. Debbie recently became involved with a man who she describes as loving and patient, and she chose to open up to him about her background of sexual compulsivity and sexual trauma. Debbie's willingness to take emotional risk in this relationship slowly builds her capacity for intimacy, and as a result, builds her nervous system resiliency. So what stands out for me about Debbie is that she was highly dysregulated when we started treatment. But when she learned to trust me a little bit at a time, and it took quite a while, our sessions and our relationship helped her regulate her nervous system. And now that she's in a relationship with someone she feels safe with, her boyfriend is really one of her greatest nervous system regulators. So that's the story of Debbie. By the way, I completely forgot to mention that if you have questions, I am going to answer them actually in a few minutes. I'm going to go for about 10 more minutes, but if you have questions, feel free to write them down. I can't remember whether I said that or not before. And then the other thing is, if you're willing to participate in a short poll after the webinar ends, a very short poll, I'm going to be signing off after the Q&A, and we would be more than happy to receive your feedback. Okay, so that was the story of Debbie, which really illustrates the kind of clients that probably you may see already, and I certainly see more and more. So How does brain spotting help our clients who are in recovery from compulsive sexual behavior? As I talked about with Debbie, it helps build the awareness of regulation versus dysregulation. I can't emphasize that enough, because just the education and the awareness that clients have about what regulation looks like, starting to realize when they're feeling more regulated and when they're feeling less regulated, can be very powerful, very empowering. That goes along with the second bullet point, which is to build somatic awareness. So Peter Levine from the somatic experiencing world, he calls it the felt sense. And the felt sense is when we're able to tap into what is happening in our body. For instance, when you're in the shower in the morning, do you notice the water coming down on you and hitting your body? That's an example of the felt sense. Not everybody has a felt sense, but it is something that can be more and more developed when the questions are asked and when we start to say things like, so what's happening physically for you right now? I noticed you started tapping your foot, or you looked away right then. Did something happen internally at that moment? You know, to just ask those different questions that are not just about thoughts and feelings, but are more about one's internal world, including sensations and somatic experiences. The third bullet point is to build capacity to return to a regulated state after the dysregulation more and more efficiently. So again, when somebody is dysregulated, what tools and strategies can they use to come back to that regulated state? And the last one says to build more range for really the fullness of one's internal life, emotions, thoughts, sensations. In sex addiction, I would say some of the biggest ones that come up, the most prominent experiences are shame, grief, fantasy, resentments, and of course the list goes on and on. So addiction, and sex addiction in particular, is what I call a misfired attempt to regulate oneself. So if somebody is dysregulated, actually an addictive process is an attempt to regulate. So for instance, let's say somebody's really upset about something that happened at their job. What do? Sometimes they'll go home and smoke a joint, or they'll have a martini, or whatever it is. And the same thing goes for compulsive sex. It's an attempt to regulate. It's actually an attempt to try and feel better, sometimes to feel less. And what I didn't include is sometimes actually to feel more, right? So sometimes it's just an attempt to feel, but it definitely is an attempt to regulate the nervous system. It's just misfired. We've gone over most of these things already, but these are the themes that I came up with in terms of what I see the most when we're talking about sex addiction and what we can process with brain spotting. When there's shame, fantastic brain spotting issue. Grief, resentment, loneliness, hurt, all kinds of abuse, neglect, abandonment, and then the feelings that are residual feelings from the secrets, from the lies, from the compartmentalizing of the sex addiction. That's a whole nother area that we can brain spot. I'm not going to go over both sides of this, but this is just something that I came up with that describes how brain spotting differs from traditional talk therapy. Brain spotting is about relational and neurobiological attunement. Brain spotting is about working with the subcortex. It involves less talk, less words. It focuses more on sensations and feelings. As we've talked about, it utilizes the visual field to access stored memories in the subcortex. And I think about the subcortex as the area of the brain that holds memories that were too much to process at the time. And it's almost like a warehouse. There's a lot of memories and images in there. And so some are more troublesome than others, but that's where brain spotting comes in. Brain spotting tends to be shorter term, of course, nervous system oriented, and emphasizes somatic awareness and the integration of one's mind, body, and spirit. So I came up with this expression, love regulates the nervous system. We could say love, we could say connection, we could say attachment, we could say intimacy, but love regulates the nervous system. This is a picture of me in Philadelphia, not too far from the Art Museum. It's a newer statue for those of you who are familiar with Philly. And you may have already heard this expression, or sorry, this quote that Johann Hari came up with. The opposite of addiction isn't sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And I couldn't agree more with that. And I believe wholeheartedly that that's really what we're talking about. And lastly, this is my contact information. I'm absolutely available for any additional questions you may have, or if you want to use me as a resource here in Los Angeles for clients who may need support out here. My website, you can reach me in a number of ways. And these are the two books that I have. The recent book, It's Not About the Sex, which has a chapter on regulating the nervous system. And my workbook, it's a coaching workbook from now on. And what I'd like to do is now go ahead and open up for any questions that you may have. And like I said, if there's anything that you want to ask that you want to identify yourself, you want to say where you're asking the question from, I'm completely open to answering any questions that you may have for me. Okay, so at this moment, I'm not seeing any questions. Oh, here comes Ron Crosswaite. Okay, thanks, Ron. Is dysregulation the same as being out of control, or in 12-step speak, unmanageable? That is a fantastic question. So I would be curious if we could talk directly about what your definition of unmanageability is. I think powerlessness and unmanageability are talked about in the 12-step rooms kind of together as a way of looking at things. I think they are parallel. You know, as I'm looking at your question, I do believe that there is something about how dysregulation oftentimes creates unmanageability. I'm not certain that all dysregulation, if something's mild, I don't think it necessarily is unmanageable and out of control, but I think it certainly has the vulnerability to that kind of thing and actually to relapse, of course. So thank you for the question, that's great. All right, Barb Waldron asked this next question. How does a clinician who hasn't been trained go about using brain spotting? Okay, and what are the next steps prior to training? Thank you, amazing webinar. Thank you, Barb. I appreciate your feedback. Well, first of all, brain spotting really does require training. And there are ways of using psychoeducation with our clients, like for instance, the resilience zone or the what's often called the window of tolerance is something that you can educate yourself about and you can start to educate your clients about, right? So that they're starting to understand the difference between regulation and dysregulation. There's also ways of starting to ask questions differently. I know that I used to ask questions very differently before I went forward. So the next steps to training in brain spotting are to go to the brainspotting.com website, and there's trainings all around the country, all around the world, all the time. And if you look for a Brain Spotting 1 training, it's usually a 3-day training. There's lots of wonderful trainers out there who are available. So that would be your next step. Thanks for the question. And Barb Waldron also asks, as an EMDR clinician who sometimes struggles with what target to process, brain spotting sounds relieving. Follow the brain. Okay, so I'm getting goosebumps because I'm not an EMDR person, and some of my best friends are EMDR clinicians. But what I love about brain spotting is that I believe it's a wider net. EMDR has way more structure, and in some ways that can be good, but I also think it becomes a little bit tight. And there's a little more creativity and openness when it comes to what brain spotting has to offer, and to really be what we call the tail of the comet. So thank you. I highly recommend you check out a brain spotting training. Okay, an anonymous attendee says, I am a recovery coach and deal with men in early recovery from substance use disorder. A high percentage of my clients have shared they feel they may suffer from sexual addiction as well. Can you treat both, refer to therapist, or treat the substance addiction first? Okay, these are fantastic and complex questions. So yes, they can be addressed together, but generally speaking, we want to make sure that we are putting out the biggest fire first. So if somebody, we want to take a safety inventory, like what are the consequences, and how bad are the consequences at this point with sex addiction? Things like, are you getting STDs? Do you have HIV? Are you losing your job? Are you hurting yourself in some way or another? Just like with substance abuse, we always want to deal with safety issues first, but I don't think there is an absolute first comes first way to go with this. I also, by the way, have a background in coaching, and what I would be encouraging of is that you would hopefully get some kind of foundation of recovery from their substance, whatever it is. And because generally the sex and intimacy issues are a little more complex and can really be, unfortunately, can make a client more vulnerable to relapse if they are going into it too deep too quickly. So I guess as I'm talking out loud, and thank you for the question, I would work on the substance first, but that doesn't mean that you can't start to mention what's happening with their sexual acting out, or to start to distinguish what they really want as a coach. What is it that what do they envision for themselves? What would they like to experience differently? You know, what are their values and their purpose, and all those good things that would help guide them towards a recovery that they feel would be more sustainable. Okay. Any other questions from anybody? We're right at 10 o'clock here in Los Angeles, and right at the hour for the rest of you. So I really thank you so much for listening and being a part of today's webinar. These areas are such a passion of mine, and I'm just so privileged to be a part of this discussion. And like I said, if you're open to participating in a short poll after I sign off, the C4 people would be really pleased to get that information from you. So thanks again for being here, and take good care.